The first snowfall of winter had begun to dust the streets of Milldale, North Carolina, like powdered sugar sifting through a cosmic sieve. Steam rose from manholes in ghostly spirals, and the neon signs of downtown shops flickered against windows already fogged with condensation. It was the kind of evening that made people hurry, heads down, collars up, eager to escape the bite of approaching winter. Diana Foster had no idea, as she stepped out of her dormitory at Milldale State University into the crisp autumn air, that she was walking into the final hours of her life. At 19, Diana possessed the kind of natural grace that made her stand out in any crowd. Her skin was the rich color of mahogany, her hair styled in the fashionable afro of the era, and her eyes held the bright intelligence of someone destined for greatness. She was a sophomore studying education, with dreams of teaching children in underprivileged communities, a calling that her friends often said was written in the gentle way she spoke to everyone she met. The campus of Milldale State stretched across rolling hills dotted with red brick buildings and ancient oak trees, their branches now bare and reaching toward the steel-gray sky like skeletal fingers. Students bundled in thick coats hurried between classes, their breath forming small clouds as they laughed and called to one another across the quadrangle. Diana pulled her burgundy wool coat tighter as she walked toward the parking lot, where her boyfriend Marcus had left his car. The 1969 Chevelle was Marcus's pride and joy, a deep blue with chrome that gleamed even in the dim light of the campus street lamps. He'd asked her to pick it up from the automotive shop downtown, where he worked part-time, and she'd agreed as she always did. Marcus was working late at the garage, trying to earn enough money to pay for their spring formal. The keys felt cold in her palm as she slid behind the wheel, adjusting the rearview mirror to check her reflection. She looked tired. She'd been up late studying for her psychology midterm, poring over textbooks until her eyes burned. But there was something else in her reflection that she couldn't quite name, a shadow of unease that she quickly dismissed as pre-exam nerves. The Chevelle's engine roared to life with a satisfying growl, and Diana carefully pulled out of the parking lot, navigating the winding campus roads with the cautious precision of someone who hadn't been driving long. The radio crackled to life as she turned the dial, Stevie Wonder's Superstition filling the car with its infectious rhythm. She hummed along, drumming her fingers on the steering wheel as she drove through the quiet residential streets that bordered the university. Milldale was the kind of town that still believed in itself, despite the social upheavals that had been tearing at the fabric of the South for the past decade. The civil rights movement had left its mark here, as it had everywhere, but the changes had come slowly, grudgingly, with a politeness that masked deeper currents of resistance. Diana was one of only 43 black students at Milldale State, a fact that she carried with quiet dignity and occasional flashes of defiant pride. As she drove toward downtown, the neighborhoods gradually shifted. The tree-lined streets of the University District gave way to older homes with sagging porches and chain-link fences, then to the commercial strips that formed the town's modest business district. The Eastgate Shopping Plaza sat at the intersection of Main Street and Highway 47, a sprawling complex of stores anchored by a Sears department store and a Piggly Wiggly grocery. The parking lot was busier than usual for a Thursday evening, filled with cars belonging to people doing their shopping before the weekend. Christmas was still more than a month away, but Diana could see holiday decorations beginning to appear in shop windows, plastic Santas and silver tinsel that caught the light from the parking lot lamps. She found a spot near the Sears entrance and pulled in carefully, checking her watch. It was 6:47 p.m. Marcus would be getting off work soon, and she wanted to surprise him by already being at the garage when he finished. She'd buy him a Coke from the vending machine and listen to him talk about the cars he'd worked on, the way she always did. Diana was reaching for her purse when she noticed the two men approaching her car. They moved with the kind of deliberate casualness that immediately set her on edge, too purposeful to be shoppers, too focused on her to be coincidental. The taller one was thin and pale, with stringy blonde hair that fell across his eyes and a denim jacket that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. His companion was stockier, with dark hair slicked back and a leather jacket that creaked as he walked. Something in their manner made Diana's hand pause on the door handle. She'd grown up in Milldale, and she knew how to read the subtle signs of trouble. These men weren't looking at her the way men usually did, with interest or appreciation, or even the uncomfortable staring she'd learned to ignore. They were looking at her like predators sizing up prey. The tall one reached her car first, tapping on the passenger window with a knuckle that bore a tattoo she couldn't quite make out. When she didn't immediately roll down the window, he walked around to the driver's side, his friend following close behind. "Excuse me, miss," the tall one said, his voice carrying a slight drawl that placed him somewhere in the rural counties surrounding Milldale. "You mind if we ask you something?" Diana kept the window rolled up, but she could hear him clearly through the glass. "I'm sorry, I'm in a hurry," she said, loud enough for him to hear. She reached for the ignition, but the car had stalled. The stockier man moved closer, and now she could see his face more clearly in the glow from the parking lot lights. He was older than his friend, maybe mid-20s, with small dark eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her appearance with uncomfortable intensity. There was something about his expression that made her stomach tighten with fear. "Now don't be unfriendly," the tall one said, and there was something in his tone that had shifted, become more aggressive. "We just want to talk to you for a minute." Diana turned the key again, and this time the engine caught. But as she reached for the gear shift, the passenger door suddenly opened, and the stocky man slid into the seat beside her with surprising speed. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said quietly, and she saw the flash of something metallic in his hand, a knife, small but wicked-looking in the dim light from the dashboard. The tall man opened the driver's door, and suddenly Diana found herself pressed between them in the front seat, her heart hammering so hard she was sure they could hear it. The knife was still visible in the stocky man's hand, held low but unmistakably threatening. "Drive," the tall one said, settling behind the wheel with an ease that suggested this wasn't his first time stealing a car. "Nice and easy, no sudden moves." "Please," Diana whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own breathing. "I don't have much money, but you can take whatever I have." "This isn't about money," the stocky man said, and something in his voice made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Through the rear window, Diana could see another figure approaching the car, a woman with bleached blonde hair and a cheap vinyl jacket, walking quickly across the parking lot with the nervous energy of someone who was late for an appointment. She slipped into the back seat without a word, bringing with her the smell of cigarettes and drugstore perfume. "Let's go, Bucky," the woman said, her voice high and nasal. "People are starting to stare." The tall man, Bucky, apparently put the car in gear and pulled slowly out of the parking spot. Diana caught a glimpse of other shoppers moving through the parking lot, ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, completely unaware of the horror unfolding just a few yards away from them. She thought about screaming, about fighting, but the knife in the stocky man's hand seemed to pulse with menace in the darkness. As they drove through the streets of Milldale, Diana tried to memorize every detail she could. The dashboard clock read 7:02 p.m. They were heading east on Highway 47, away from the town center and toward the rural areas where tobacco farms stretched for miles between stands of pine forest. The stocky man, she heard the woman call him Jake, kept the knife low but visible, occasionally glancing at her with those small dark eyes that seemed to catalog her fear. "Where are we going?" Diana asked, proud that her voice didn't shake more than it did. "Somewhere quiet," Jake said. "Somewhere we can talk without being interrupted." The woman in the back seat laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Talk," she repeated. "That's rich." Diana felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but she blinked them away. Whatever these people wanted from her, she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break down. She thought about Marcus, probably wondering where she was by now. She thought about her parents, who'd worked 2 jobs each to send her to college. She thought about the children she'd planned to teach, the difference she'd hoped to make in the world. The highway gave way to narrow country roads, lined with bare fields and patches of dark forest. The lights of Milldale faded behind them, until there was nothing but the sweep of the car's headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. Diana could smell the approaching snow in the air that seeped through the car's windows, and she shivered despite her wool coat. They drove for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes before Bucky turned onto a dirt road that disappeared into a stand of tall pines. The car bounced and lurched over ruts and holes, branches scraping against the windows with sounds like fingernails on a blackboard. "This is good," Jake said, and Bucky pulled the car to a stop in a small clearing surrounded by trees. In the sudden silence that followed the turning off of the engine, Diana could hear the wind moving through the pine boughs above them, a sound like whispered threats. The darkness beyond the headlights was complete, the kind of rural darkness that seemed to swallow light and sound and hope. "Get out," Jake said, and the knife glinted as he gestured toward the door. Diana's hands were shaking now as she opened the door and stepped out into the cold night air. The ground was soft with fallen pine needles and the first scattered snowflakes of the season. She could smell the sharp scent of pine sap and the earthier odor of decomposing leaves. The woman got out of the back seat and immediately lit a cigarette, the flame from her lighter briefly illuminating a face that was younger than Diana had expected. Probably not much older than herself, but already bearing the lines of someone who'd lived a harder life. "What's your name?" Jake asked as he came around the car to stand next to her. "Diana," she whispered. "Well, Diana," he said, and she could see his teeth in the darkness as he smiled. "I hope you said your prayers this morning." That was when Diana knew, with a certainty that cut through her fear like a blade through silk, that she was going to die in these woods. The knowledge hit her like a physical blow, doubling her over as if someone had punched her in the stomach. She was 19 years old, a sophomore in college with dreams of teaching and changing the world, and she was going to die in a clearing in the woods at the hands of strangers whose names she barely knew. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, something else sparked to life in Diana Foster's chest, a flame of defiance that refused to be extinguished. If she was going to die, she would not die easily. If these monsters wanted to take her life, they would have to work for it. She thought about the self-defense class she'd taken the previous semester, the instructor's voice echoing in her memory, "Fight dirty, fight mean, and never stop fighting until you can't fight anymore." Diana tensed her muscles, preparing to run or fight or scream whatever opportunity presented itself first. Around her, the pine trees swayed in the wind, their branches creaking like old bones, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the lonely howl of a train whistle carrying its cargo through the North Carolina night. In the headlights of Marcus's stolen Chevelle, 4 lives were about to intersect in ways that would haunt Ashford County for decades to come. But Diana Foster, scared and 19, and far from home, was not ready to surrender without a fight. The wind picked up, scattering snowflakes like ash from a distant fire, and in that moment before violence erupted in the clearing, time seemed to suspend itself like a held. What happened next would be discovered 8 days later by a hunter following deer tracks through the pine forest, and it would launch an investigation that would expose the darkest corners of human nature and challenge everything the people of Milldale thought they knew about justice, mercy, and the true cost of hatred. But first, Diana Foster had to fight for her life. The fight lasted less than 3 minutes. Diana Foster's first instinct was to run, to bolt toward the tree line, and lose herself in the darkness of the pine forest. But as she spun toward the woods, Jake's hand closed around her wrist with crushing force, his fingers digging into her skin like iron claws. "Where do you think you're going?" he snarled, yanking her back toward the car's headlights. Diana twisted in his grip, bringing her knee up toward his groin the way she'd been taught in that self-defense class. But Jake was ready for her, shifting his body to take the blow on his thigh instead. The knife flashed in his other hand, and Diana felt a line of fire across her shoulder as the blade sliced through her coat and the sweater beneath. "Bucky," Jake called out. "Help me with this wildcat." The tall man was already moving, circling around to cut off her escape route. In the glow from the headlights, his face looked skeletal, all sharp angles and hollow shadows. The blonde woman, Diana still didn't know her name, remained by the car, smoking her cigarette and watching the struggle with the detached interest of someone watching a television program. Diana tried to scream, but Jake's hand clamped over her mouth, muffling the sound. She bit down hard, tasting blood, and he cursed as he jerked his hand away. "Help!" she screamed into the darkness. "Somebody help me!" But there was no one to hear her. The nearest house was miles away, and the sound of her voice was swallowed by the wind in the pines and the vast indifference of the Carolina countryside. Jake backhanded her across the face, the blow sending stars exploding across her vision. She staggered but didn't fall, driven by an adrenaline-fueled determination that seemed to surprise her attackers. "Too feisty," Jake replied grimly. "Hold her arms." What happened next in that clearing would be reconstructed later by forensic investigators, pieced together from physical evidence and the contradictory statements of the participants. But in those moments, as Diana Foster fought for her life among the pine trees, the only witnesses were the stars overhead and the indifferent wind. The struggle ended when Jake found a rock. It was larger than a softball, smaller than a bowling ball, a chunk of granite that some long ago glacier had deposited in the North Carolina soil. In the beam of the car's headlights, it seemed to glow with malevolent intent as Jake hefted it in both hands. Diana's last coherent thought was of Marcus, waiting for her at the garage, probably checking his watch and wondering where she could be. Then the darkness claimed her, and the pine forest settled back into its ancient silence. 8 days later, the frost had come early that year, turning the pine needles brittle and coating the forest floor with a crystalline carpet that crunched underfoot. Bobby Ray Hutchins was following deer tracks when he saw something that didn't belong among the trees, a flash of burgundy wool that stood out against the brown and green of the woodland. At first he thought it might be a discarded piece of clothing, the kind of litter that sometimes found its way into remote areas. But as he pushed through the undergrowth toward the splash of color, the shape began to resolve itself into something that made his stomach turn over. Bobby Ray had been hunting these woods for 30 years, and he'd seen his share of death deer brought down by his rifle, possums hit by cars, the occasional cow that had wandered too far from its pasture and died of exposure. But he had never seen anything like what lay in the clearing among the pines. The body was naked, pale as winter moonlight, positioned with the deliberate cruelty that spoke of human malevolence rather than natural predation. Animals killed to eat or to protect their territory. Only humans killed for the pleasure of causing pain. Bobby Ray stumbled backward, his hunting rifle forgotten in his hands, and emptied his stomach against the trunk of a pine tree. When the retching stopped, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and forced himself to look again, to be sure of what he was seeing. The woman was young, younger than his own daughter, who was away at college in Raleigh. African-American with natural hair that might have been beautiful once but was now matted with blood and forest debris. Her eyes were closed, and for a moment Bobby Ray found himself hoping that she had died quickly without too much pain. But the evidence suggested otherwise. He turned away from the scene and began the long walk back to his truck, his hands shaking so badly that he had trouble finding his keys. The drive back to town passed in a blur of autumn countryside and growing dread. Bobby Ray had lived in Ashford County all his life, and he knew that what he'd found in the woods would change things, would bring reporters and investigators, and the kind of attention that small towns preferred to avoid. But there was no avoiding it now. Someone had been murdered in the pine forest, and Bobby Ray Hutchins was the man who had to report it. The Ashford County Sheriff's Department occupied a squat brick building on Main Street, wedged between Murphy's 5 and Dime and the Rexall Pharmacy. Sheriff Ezra Morrison had been expecting a quiet Friday afternoon, maybe a drunk and disorderly call, possibly some teenagers shoplifting at the Piggly Wiggly. He was not expecting Bobby Ray Hutchins to walk into his office looking like he'd seen a ghost and tell him about a dead body in the pine forest. "You sure about what you saw, Bobby Ray?" Morrison asked, leaning back in his chair with the careful deliberation of a man who'd learned not to jump to conclusions. "Dead sure," Bobby Ray replied, and immediately winced at his choice of words. "Sheriff, I've been hunting those woods since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. I know the difference between a dead deer and a dead person." Morrison was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. He'd been sheriff of Ashford County for 12 years, elected and re-elected on a platform of keeping the peace and maintaining the status quo. Murder was not part of the status quo. "All right," Morrison said, reaching for his coat and hat. "Let's go have a look." The drive out to the pine forest took 20 minutes, following the same route that Diana Foster had traveled 8 days earlier. Morrison's deputy, Carl Brennan, followed in a second patrol car, along with Doc Henley, who served as the county coroner when the need arose. The clearing looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, less ominous than it had appeared in the beam of car headlights. But the evil that had been done there was still palpable, a wrongness that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Doc Henley was the first to reach the body, his medical training overriding the natural human revulsion that made the others hang back. He was a thin man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the gentle manner of someone who'd spent his life trying to heal rather than harm. "How long?" Morrison asked, standing at the edge of the clearing with his hands clasped behind his back. "Hard to say exactly," Doc Henley replied, not looking up from his examination. "The cold weather's slowed decomposition, but I'd estimate 7 to 10 days, maybe longer." Deputy Brennan was walking the perimeter of the clearing, looking for evidence. He was young, barely 25, and this was his first murder scene. Morrison could see the kid fighting to keep his breakfast down, but to his credit he kept working. "Sheriff," Brennan called out from near a stand of pines at the edge of the clearing, "you need to see this." Morrison walked over to where his deputy was standing. There, partially hidden by fallen leaves and pine needles, was a collection of items that made his jaw tighten with anger. A woman's clothes, a burgundy wool coat, a yellow sweater, brown slacks, undergarments, all carefully arranged, as if someone had taken pains to fold them neatly before discarding them. And beside the clothes, a small pile of personal effects, a wristwatch with a delicate gold band, a pair of earrings that caught the afternoon sunlight, a student ID card from Milldale State University. "Diana Elizabeth Foster," Morrison read from the ID card. "Born November 3rd. The photograph on the card showed a young woman with bright eyes and a smile that spoke of intelligence and hope. Looking at it, Morrison felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. The realization that this case was going to be different from anything he'd dealt with before. "Carl," he said to his deputy, "I want you to drive back to town and call the state police. Tell them we need a crime scene team out here, and we need them fast." "Yes, sir," Brennan replied, already heading back toward his patrol car. Morrison remained in the clearing as the afternoon shadows lengthened, trying to piece together what had happened here. The evidence suggested that Diana Foster had been brought to this remote location against her will. There were tire tracks in the soft earth, partially obscured by the recent frost, but still visible to trained eyes. Doc Henley finished his preliminary examination and approached the sheriff, pulling off his gloves with the careful precision of long practice. "Blunt force trauma to the head," Doc Henley replied grimly. "Multiple impacts. And there are other injuries." He trailed off, not wanting to specify the details in the open air of the forest. Morrison nodded. He'd seen enough in his years as sheriff to understand what the doctor wasn't saying. "Any idea what kind of weapon?" "Something heavy and irregular. A rock, most likely. There are granite outcroppings all through these woods." As if summoned by the doctor's words, Brennan's voice crackled through Morrison's radio. "Sheriff, you need to get back to town. We've got a situation." "What kind of situation?" "Missing person report came in about an hour ago. Diana Foster's boyfriend filed it, said she was supposed to meet him at the garage where he works, but she never showed up. That was 8 days ago." Morrison looked down at the ID card in his hand, at the photograph of the young woman who would never fulfill the promise shining in her eyes. "I'm on my way," he said into the radio. The drive back to town gave Morrison time to think, and what he was thinking about was the complexity that had just entered his life. A murder was bad enough, but the murder of a young black college student in 1973 North Carolina was the kind of case that could tear a community apart. Ashford County had navigated the civil rights era with less violence than many parts of the South, but that didn't mean the old tensions had disappeared. They'd simply gone underground, simmering beneath a surface of polite civility that fooled nobody who'd lived here long enough to know better. And now those tensions were about to be laid bare by the death of Diana Foster. Marcus Washington was waiting at the sheriff's office when Morrison arrived, a young man of about 20 with worried eyes and hands that couldn't seem to stay still. He worked at Patterson's garage on the other side of town. Morrison knew, a good kid from a good family, the kind of young man who went to church on Sundays and called his elders sir and ma'am. "Sheriff Morrison," Marcus said, rising from his chair as the older man entered the office. "Deputy Brennan said you might have some information about Diana." Morrison looked at the young man and felt the weight of the news he was about to deliver. In his experience, there was no easy way to tell someone that their world had just ended. "Son," he said gently, "I think you'd better sit down." The conversation that followed was one that Morrison would remember for the rest of his life. The way the hope died in Marcus Washington's eyes, the sound he made when the reality of Diana's death hit him, the way his hands shook as he tried to process information that no 20-year-old should have to hear. "Who would do this?" Marcus asked when he could finally speak again. "Diana never hurt anybody in her life. She was going to be a teacher. She wanted to help kids." Morrison had no answer for that question, but he made a silent promise to himself and to the memory of Diana Foster that he would find one. Somewhere in Ashford County, the people responsible for this atrocity were going about their daily lives, probably thinking they'd gotten away with murder. They were wrong. The investigation was just beginning, and already Morrison could feel the weight of it settling on his shoulders like a shroud. The break came on a Tuesday morning, 18 days after Diana Foster's body was discovered in the pine forest. Sheriff Morrison was sitting in his office, surrounded by case files and crime scene photographs, when Deputy Brennan knocked on his door with the kind of urgency that made Morrison's pulse quicken. "Sheriff, we got a hit on the bolo," Brennan said, slightly out of breath from running up the stairs. "Highway Patrol spotted the Chevelle about 50 miles north of here, parked outside a diner in Rockingham County." Morrison was on his feet before Brennan finished speaking. They'd put out a be-on-the-lookout bulletin for Marcus Washington's stolen car within hours of discovering Diana's body. But Morrison had begun to fear that the vehicle had been ditched in some remote location where it might never be found. "Who's driving it?" Morrison asked, reaching for his coat and gun belt. "That's the interesting part," Brennan replied. "Highway Patrol says it's a white male, mid-20s with long blonde hair. Fits the description of that fellow we're looking for." The description had come from Ann Stoltzfus, a Mennonite woman who'd been shopping at the Eastgate Plaza the night Diana disappeared. She'd noticed 2 men approaching a young black woman's car in the parking lot, and something about their behavior had stuck in her memory. When news of Diana's murder broke, she'd come forward with her story. "He's got someone with him," Brennan continued. "A woman, bleached blonde hair, looks rough around the edges." Morrison felt a surge of adrenaline that he hadn't experienced in years. After 18 days of chasing shadows and following dead-end leads, they finally had their suspects in sight. "Call the state police," Morrison ordered. "Tell them we're on our way, and tell them not to approach until we get there. I want these bastards alive." The drive to Rockingham County took 45 minutes through rolling countryside that was just beginning to show the first hints of spring. Morrison pushed his patrol car as hard as he dared, the speedometer hovering near 80 as they raced toward what might be their only chance to catch Diana Foster's killers. The diner was a typical roadside establishment, a long, low building with chrome trim and neon signs advertising coffee and pie. Marcus's blue Chevelle sat in the parking lot like an accusation, its chrome dulled by weeks of neglect and weather. State Police Captain Jake Riley was waiting for them when they arrived, a lean man with graying temples and the kind of steady eyes that Morrison respected in a fellow lawman. "They're still inside," Riley reported quietly. "The man matches your description, Thomas Buckman, goes by Bucky. Got a record for petty theft and assault. The woman is Rita Mae Crowder, prostitution and drug charges. They've been in there for about 20 minutes, just drinking coffee and talking." Morrison peered through the diner's windows and felt his blood pressure spike. There, sitting in a booth near the back, were two of the people responsible for Diana Foster's death. They looked so ordinary. Just another pair of drifters grabbing a meal at a roadside diner, that it was hard to believe they were capable of such monstrous cruelty. "What about the third one?" Morrison asked. "The other man?" "No sign of him," Riley replied. "But we ran the names through the system, and Buckman's got a known associate, Jacob Lee Hennings. Goes by Jake. Armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon. Real charmer." Morrison studied the two suspects through the window, memorizing their faces. Buckman was thin and pale, with stringy blonde hair that fell across his eyes. Even sitting down, he radiated a nervous energy that suggested he was always ready to run or fight. The woman Crowder looked tired and strung out, the kind of person who'd been living hard for too many years. "All right," Morrison said. "Let's take them." The arrest went smoothly. Buckman reached for something inside his jacket when he saw the officers approaching, but Morrison's service revolver was already drawn, and the man had enough sense to freeze with his hands visible. "Thomas Buckman," Morrison said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone who'd done this many times before. "You're under arrest for the murder of Diana Elizabeth Foster." The look that crossed Buckman's face was like watching a mask slip. Surprise, then calculation, then the sullen defiance of someone who'd been caught but wasn't ready to admit it. Rita Mae Crowder started crying before the handcuffs were even on her wrists, tears cutting tracks through makeup that had been applied hours earlier and was now smeared from the humidity in the diner. "I didn't kill nobody," she kept saying as Deputy Brennan led her toward the patrol car. "I didn't kill that girl. I just went along for the ride." The interrogation began that afternoon in the small conference room that served as the Ashford County Sheriff's Department's interrogation facility. Morrison had learned long ago that the key to breaking suspects was patience. Let them talk, let them contradict themselves, and eventually the truth would emerge. Buckman went first, sitting across from Morrison, with his arms folded and his jaw set in stubborn silence. He'd asked for a lawyer, which was his right, but Morrison could still ask questions, and sometimes what suspects didn't say was as revealing as what they did. "You know why you're here, Bucky," Morrison said conversationally. "Diana Foster, 19 years old, college student. Someone killed her in the pine forest 8 days after she disappeared from the Eastgate shopping plaza." Buckman stared at the table, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the scarred wood. A muscle twitched in Buckman's jaw, but he didn't speak. "Or paint chips. We found some on a tree branch near where Diana's body was discovered. Blue paint, the exact same color as the Chevelle you were driving. Imagine that." Morrison let the silence stretch, watching as Buckman's composure began to crack around the edges. "Your friend Jake's already talking," Morrison lied smoothly. "Says it was all your idea. Says you were the one who picked out Diana in the parking lot." "That's bullshit," Buckman snapped, finally breaking his silence. "Jake don't know nothing about nothing." Morrison leaned back in his chair, satisfied that he'd gotten the man talking. "So you do know Jake Hennings," he said. Funny, because Rita May says she's never heard of him. The interrogation continued for 3 hours, with Morrison slowly building a wall of evidence and contradictions around Buckman, until the man's story began to collapse. By the time they were finished, Buckman had admitted to being in the shopping plaza that night, to approaching Diana's car, even to driving her out to the pine forest. But he insisted that Jake Hennings had been the one to actually kill her. Rita Mae Crowder's interrogation was shorter but more productive. She was scared, strung out, and desperate to avoid being charged with murder. Within 2 hours, she'd told Morrison everything. How Buckman and Hennings had spotted Diana in the parking lot, how they'd forced their way into her car, how they'd driven her out to the woods. "I stayed by the car," she insisted, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want no part of what they were gonna do. But Bucky, he said if I tried to leave, he'd kill me too." "What exactly did they do?" Morrison asked gently. They made her take off her clothes. And then Jake, he found this rock." She broke down completely then, her story dissolving into sobs and half-coherent fragments. But Morrison had heard enough to know that they had their killers. The manhunt for Jacob Lee Hennings lasted 6 weeks and stretched across 4 states. He was finally captured in a motel outside Portland, Oregon, by FBI agents who'd been tracking him through a series of armed robberies. When they brought him back to North Carolina in shackles, Morrison was waiting at the airport. Hennings was stockier than his partner, with dark hair and small, mean eyes that seemed to catalog everyone and everything around him with predatory calculation. Unlike Buckman, he showed no remorse, no fear, no human emotion beyond a cold contempt for the world and everyone in it. His interrogation lasted 6 hours and yielded nothing but denials and accusations against his partners. According to Hennings, he'd never been to Ashford County, had never met Diana Foster, and certainly hadn't killed her. Buckman and Crowder were lying, he insisted, trying to save their own skins by pinning the murder on him. But the evidence told a different story. Rita Mae Crowder had led investigators to a creek bed where Hennings had thrown Diana's jewelry, trying to get rid of anything that could connect him to the crime. Her wristwatch and earrings were recovered from the muddy bottom, still recognizable despite weeks of exposure to the elements. More damning still was the testimony of Earl Watson, a mechanic at a garage in the next county over. He'd sold Hennings a tire iron 3 days before Diana's murder, a tire iron that matched the distinctive pattern of injuries on the victim's skull. The trials began in the spring of 1974, almost 5 months after Diana Foster's death. Thomas Buckman was tried first, in a courtroom packed with reporters, family members, and curious onlookers drawn by the sensational nature of the case. The prosecution, led by District Attorney William Cross, painted a picture of premeditated murder motivated by racial hatred and sexual violence. Diana Foster was chosen as a victim for one reason. Cross told the jury during his opening statement. The color of her skin. These men saw a young black woman alone in a parking lot, and they decided to take her life simply because they could. Buckman's defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named Robert Hayes, argued that his client had been coerced by the more violent Hennings and had never intended for Diana to be harmed. "Thomas Buckman is not a killer," Hayes insisted. "He's a petty criminal who got in over his head with a genuine sociopath. Yes, he made terrible choices that night. Yes, he bears responsibility for what happened. But he did not murder Diana Foster." The trial lasted 2 weeks, with Morrison testifying about the investigation and Rita Mae Crowder taking the stand to describe the night of the murder. Her testimony was devastating, a minute-by-minute account of Diana's final hours that left several jurors in tears. Marcus Washington also testified, describing Diana's dreams and aspirations, painting a picture of a young woman whose life had been cut short just as it was beginning to bloom. "She wanted to teach," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said education was the key to changing the world, one child at a time." The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning a verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. Judge Harrison Crockett sentenced Thomas Buckman to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jacob Lee Hennings's trial was a different affair entirely. Unlike Buckman, who'd shown at least some remorse during his testimony, Hennings remained defiant throughout the proceedings. He refused to testify on his own behalf, instead glaring at witnesses and occasionally making comments that his attorney had to suppress. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Rita Mae Crowder testified again, describing how Hennings had been the driving force behind Diana's abduction and murder. Physical evidence, the tire iron, the recovered jewelry, witness testimony, built an unshakable case for his guilt. But it was District Attorney Cross's closing argument that sealed Hennings's fate. Some crimes are so heinous, so deliberately cruel, that they demand the ultimate penalty, Cross told the jury. Jacob Hennings didn't just kill Diana Foster. He tortured her. He turned her final hours into a nightmare of terror and pain, and he did it because he enjoyed it. The jury took less than 4 hours to return their verdict. Guilty on all counts. Judge Crockett sentenced Hennings to death in the electric chair. Rita Mae Crowder, in exchange for her testimony, pled guilty to accessory after the fact and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. She served 6 years before being released on parole, disappearing into the anonymous landscape of American poverty and desperation. The appeals process for Jacob Hennings dragged on for 5 years, working its way through the state and federal court systems with the grinding slowness of legal machinery. His lawyers argued ineffective counsel, prosecutorial misconduct, and cruel and unusual punishment, but each appeal was denied in turn. On March 15, 1979, almost exactly 5 years after Diana Foster's murder, Jacob Lee Hennings was executed at Central Prison in Raleigh. He made no final statement, showed no remorse, and died as he had lived, without a trace of human compassion or decency. Thomas Buckman remained in prison, where he would spend the rest of his life. He died in 2003 of a heart attack, having served nearly 30 years behind bars for his role in Diana Foster's murder. Sheriff Ezra Morrison retired in 1985, but he never forgot the case that had defined the final decade of his career. In his retirement speech, he spoke about Diana Foster, about her dreams, her potential, and the terrible waste of her death. She wanted to be a teacher, Morrison said to the gathered crowd of colleagues and community members. She wanted to change the world. In a way, I suppose she did. Her death taught us something about ourselves, about the capacity for evil that lurks in the human heart, but also about our ability to seek justice, even when it's difficult and painful. Marcus Washington eventually became a teacher himself, fulfilling the dream that he and Diana had shared. He named his first classroom the Diana Foster Learning Center, and every year on the anniversary of her death, he would tell his students her story, not the brutal details of her murder, but the story of her life, her aspirations, and her belief that education could make the world a better place. The pine forest where Diana died was eventually cleared for development, transformed into a suburban neighborhood of modest homes and tree-lined streets. A small park was built where the clearing had been, with a memorial bench bearing a simple inscription, "In memory of Diana Elizabeth Foster, 1954-1973, teacher, dreamer, beloved daughter." Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind moves through the young trees that have replaced the ancient pines, visitors to the park report hearing something that might be whispers, the voices of dreams that were never fulfilled, hopes that were cut short by human cruelty, and the eternal question that echoes through every tragedy. What might have been? But Diana Foster's story didn't end with her death in the pine forest of Ashford County. It lived on in the classrooms where her dream of education as transformation continued to inspire new generations of teachers and students. It lived on in the memories of those who loved her, and in the pursuit of justice that proved that even in the darkest corners of human experience, light could still prevail. The case of Diana Foster became a landmark in North Carolina legal history, one of the first interracial murders to result in the death penalty for white defendants in the post-civil rights era. But more than a legal precedent, it was a reminder that justice, however imperfect and delayed, was still possible when good people refused to give up the fight. Sheriff Morrison had kept his promise to Diana Foster. He had found her killers, and he had made sure they paid the price for their crimes. It wasn't enough to bring her back, nothing ever could be, but it was enough to prove that her life had mattered, that her dreams had been worth pursuing, and that even in death she had not been forgotten. In the end, perhaps that was the best any of them could hope for, to be remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived, and for the dreams they carried with them into the darkness. The pine trees that had witnessed Diana Foster's final moments were gone now, replaced by saplings that knew nothing of the tragedy that had occurred in their shadow. But the memory remained, carved not in stone or bronze, but in the hearts and minds of those who refused to let her story be forgotten. And on quiet evenings, when the wind moves through the branches of the memorial park, some say you can still hear it, the whisper of dreams deferred, but not destroyed, the echo of a young woman's voice, promising to change the world, one child at a time.